Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Funkhouser. He's professor and departmental chair of philosophy at the University of Arkansas. His main areas of research are in the philosophy of psychology slash mind and metaphysics, and today we're going to talk about some of the work he's been doing on beliefs, their functions, their social functions specifically, and also we're going to talk a little bit about self-deception. So, Dr. Funkhouser, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I love your podcast.
Great, thank you. So let's start perhaps with some. In this particular case, I want to start with a definition or at least an understanding of what beliefs are, because as far as I understand it, the way people think about beliefs and the way they define them or not, there's no consensus on it, and different people define them in different ways, like philosophers of mind and perhaps cognitive scientists. So, what would be your definition of how do you think we should understand the concept of belief?
Okay, that's obviously a good question to start with. I tried to be as neutral and broad as possible in my understanding of belief, but of course I have views here that not everyone's going to accept. So if I had to succinctly say what belief is, it's just the most general attitude regarding a proposition as true. And then there are follow-up questions like, what does that mean to regard a proposition as true? But it's not supposed to be like domain or I'm sorry, situation specific. So it's supposed to be an overall attitude, belief is, that holds for the most part across context, not just accepting proposition as true in this one situation, but in general, accepting it as true. Um, uh, Beliefs, I think, are dispositional states. Okay. They dispose us to think, to feel, to act in certain ways. We're not always aware of what it is that we believe. And because of that, we are fallible when it comes to self-knowledge of our beliefs. We may think we believe something that we don't actually believe. Okay, so we might not be aware of all of our beliefs. And I think that there are many factors that contribute to determining what it is that we regard as true. Our judgments, our assertions are pretty good indicators of what we regard as true. So our actions, okay, what we accept as a premise in practical reasoning. But the problem is that these things can conflict. We may assert that something is true, but we may act otherwise. And so we have to weigh all these different factors. As a general rule, I tend to weigh behavior more than other factors in determining what it is that people believe. I think actions tend to speak louder than words. I also think actions in higher stakes situations are better indicators of belief. That shows what you really believe if you're willing to act on it in a high stakes environment. One thing I should say that's kind of distinctive, not original by any means, but distinctive about my understanding of belief is that the norms of epistemology, okay, don't override every other kind of norm or function that belief can have. A lot of times people have beliefs not for good epistemic reasons, and sometimes their beliefs serve functions besides getting at the truth. Okay, so for several years now, my research has been in the area of what I'd call motivated reasoning or strategic incentivized reasoning, where people favor a belief not because it's true, but for some other reason they're incentivized to believe it as true. So, like one controversial aspect of my understanding of belief is that belief doesn't have to strongly aim at the truth, even though when you believe something, you do genuinely regard it as true.
Yeah.
That was a mouthful. I should probably pause a little bit and see.
Yeah, we definitely need to unpack all of that, and there are at least 3 points there that you made that I would like to get more into. So, first of all, at a certain point there at the beginning, you mentioned something along the lines of beliefs not having to be, we not having to be necessarily aware of our beliefs. So, does that mean that some of our beliefs might be essentially unconscious? Let's say we cannot really have conscious access to them. I mean, I'm asking you that because we have this sort of common sense view of beliefs as something that, I mean, if you believe it, you should know that you believe it, right? Or that beliefs are always necessarily something that we have conscious access to. But you're saying that that's not necessarily always true?
Good question. I don't have completely I'm not committed to a very specific position here, but I mean, it depends in part what you mean by accessible to
Okay.
consciousness. Like accessibility comes in degrees. There are certainly things that I think we believe that we're not consciously aware of. Now, could we access them? Well, in principle, like sometimes people go to therapy to try to uncover their beliefs and those unconscious beliefs that are being sought are accessible in some sense. Like they could, after going through a certain process, be accessed, or just in regular life, if people point out things to you about your behavior, maybe you then realize, oh, I do believe this, and I wasn't aware of it. So it depends what you mean by accessible. Accessible could mean like you could access it right now, or it could mean after going through some kind of process like therapy or having other people point out things to you, you can uncover it. I tend to think that most beliefs that are, if not all beliefs that are unconscious, are in principle accessible to consciousness. They could be accessed. Yeah.
Right. I mean, because we tend to have this idea that beliefs are something that we can talk about. I mean, even if sometimes we are not completely sure of what our beliefs are, or we don't have a definite answer to this or that question, at least we can say, so I'm not sure about that, or I'm not sure on that topic, something like that. But we tend to have this idea that wherever our beliefs are, even if we're not completely settled on particular issues, that we can always talk about them.
Yeah, that's true. I guess if there's one lesson that would try to draw though is that I think people tend to be overly confident about how much they're aware of, how much they know what they actually believe. Okay, and when people get things wrong about what they believe, when they say they believe something and they really don't, I don't necessarily think that they're lying to us. They could be quite sincere and they're just mistaken. Just a failure of self-knowledge. So I agree with the spirit of what you're saying. We tend to think that beliefs are something that yes, we do have access to, and we can scrutinize, and we can say, should I believe this? Of course, we report them on surveys when people ask and things like that. Like, what do you believe, Ricardo? And you can answer this, but I think people tend to be a little bit overconfident in thinking they definitively know, what it is they believe.
Okay, and how do we know then? How do we study? What are the several different approaches we have at our disposal to really figure out if the beliefs that people express are really their beliefs, if they really believe what they say they believe, or if that's not the case?
Okay, like from a third person point of view, if we're looking at another person and trying to figure out what it is that they really believe, I mean, I tend to accept kind of like a lesson of behaviorism that I'm not a behaviorist about mental states, but I do think that behavior should be given greatest weight. I mean, this is one of the, like, why do we care so much about what people believe? If you go back to people who've written about the ethics of belief, people like W.K. Clifford, his famous, essay on the ethics of belief, I take seriously a lot of the lessons we were taught by Clifford. That is that beliefs are important. There's an ethics of belief because they guide our actions. Okay, and beliefs aren't just private; they're also public. And so these are the primary reasons why Clifford thought that ethics applies to beliefs just like it does to actions, because beliefs guide our actions, and they're not just private. We pass them on to other people. So I would tend to look at actions as a better indicator of belief than mere assertion. In psychology and the social sciences, a lot of times they draw conclusions about what people believe just based on the results of answers that they give. Basically, there are assertions, like there are surveys or polls, and these are supposed to, just the answers that people give are supposed to indicate like what it is they really believe. But we know that's not 100% accurate, that people don't always know what it is they believe. And then there are other problems. People outright lie sometimes. And even if they're not lying, there's what's called expressive responding, where they give an answer that's kind of like cheerleading for their side. Like a good example of this is after the 2016 U.S. presidential election, people were, after the inauguration of Trump, he claimed he had this big crowd there, bigger than Obama's, and they'd show photographs to partisans, like here's the Obama crowd, here's the Trump crowd, which one's bigger? And a lot of Trump supporters would say the Trump crowd, when the photograph doesn't reveal this. The people aren't necessarily reporting what it is they believe. They're just showing their support for Trump by saying the Trump one is better. So we know that this is a problem, that when people say that they believe something, when they assert it, it's not necessarily indicative of what they really believe. They're not always liars when they say something false about what they believe. They could also just be confabulating, making up a position on the fly. That's very common as well. Now, a complication, if I may add, about using behavior to infer what people believe is there's not a direct, like, one-to-one mapping between beliefs and behavior. Because, like, if you believe something, it doesn't require that you act in one very specific way. Your behavior is determined holistically by everything else you believe and you desire. So in any particular case, if someone doesn't act in the way that we would expect a believer to act, that belief ascription could nevertheless be maintained by making enough auxiliary assumptions elsewhere. Say, oh, well, that's because they also believe this and wanted this. It's kind of Quinean point about, the web of belief is what Quine would talk about, where you can make moves elsewhere to always preserve some claim. Something like that also holds for psychology. You say, okay, even though the person didn't act as a believer generally would, there's an explanation for why they didn't. So that's a complication also.
And also related to that complication, I was thinking that, the fact that there's not always a one-to-one correspondence between a particular behavior and a particular belief. Isn't it also the case that when we see someone behaving in a particular way, there are perhaps many different beliefs related to that particular kind of behavior that we might associate with that behavior. It's very hard to imagine that there would be a behavior that associated with it, we would think that there would be only one single interpretation to that behavior that would correspond to a particular belief, right?
Right, and that's probably why we rely on things like assertions and just background assumptions about what people in this culture tend to believe or something, to help like winnow down the viable candidates of like, okay, what are the operative beliefs here? Those background assumptions and the assertions that people have, and that I'm not saying that we should completely dismiss assertion as a guide to belief. Of course, that's very helpful, but we shouldn't think that it's completely authoritative. We should, if we detect behavior that systematically doesn't align with the assertion, we can legitimately say, okay, the person doesn't believe what they say they believe. Either they're lying or they just lack self-knowledge or something like that of their own beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, your point is well taken. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, still talking about behavior, let's say that, for example, for a particular belief, we have a repertoire of behaviors that we have established that usually go associated with it, and we see that someone behaves in a way that does not go along or correspond at all with that particular set of behaviors. It's a behavior that really goes into conflict with that particular kind of belief. So if that happens, should we always assume that if there's that disconnect between a particular belief and the behavior that person exhibits, then that person does not really hold that belief or cannot hold it? Or if she, for example, stated that she believes X but does not behave accordingly, then should we assume that she is an hypocrite, for example?
Right. There's no. My answer I think is going to disappoint you a bit because it's not decisive. Of course, if there's that failure to behave as expected,
Mm-hmm.
it could be due, for example, just to weakness of will.
Yeah.
So suppose, well, the claim is someone has these religious beliefs, and if you have those religious beliefs, you're supposed to go to religious services, you're supposed to treat people in a certain way, all this repertoire, like you were talking about, of behaviors that you expect of someone that has those religious beliefs. And then you're imagining someone who says that maybe they have these beliefs, but they don't behave in those ways. It is possible to actually have those beliefs and fail to act just because you're weak-willed. But at some point, I mean, if you systematically fail to act as expected, we're going to say, okay, you don't really have those beliefs in the first place. Like you're a hypocrite or something like that. Yeah.
So then another aspect that you mentioned there at a certain point, and I think it was also alluded to when you gave the example of the Obama versus the Trump inauguration ceremonies and how people interpreted the photographs they saw, and if they saw that, for example, there were more people in the Trump inauguration ceremony versus the Obama inauguration ceremony, or vice versa, depending on if they were, for example, a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, is it really the case that if someone expresses a belief, they really necessarily believe it? I mean, because in that particular example, people could be, I don't know, a Trump supporter could be claiming that there were in fact more people at the Trump inauguration ceremony just because, since he is a Trump supporter, he feels the need to be like a team player and manifest that belief, even though he or she, when she looks at the picture, she really does see that there's not really more people at the Trump inauguration ceremony than at the Obama one, right?
Right. Yeah, I meant that example to be a case in which the person doesn't really believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that just doing the cheerleading. It's hard in that example to not see the person as just kind of being deceitful.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that they're aware that they're like saying a falsehood,
Yeah.
but there are other cases of so-called cheerleading and expressive responding where it's clear or more plausible at least that the person isn't being deceitful. They're being sincere, but nevertheless, they're not reporting what they actually believe. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Right.
But I mean, there are clearly, I guess, examples, and some of them, I guess, might even involve some religious beliefs where, I mean, people might say something, but they also at the same time might be aware that they are just expressing a belief just to, I don't know, be just to signal that they are part of a particular social group, for example, but at the same time they know that they do not literally believe it.
Right. That certainly happens also. And I should say, like, as a kind of overarching point. So I said I'm interested in all these cases of motivated reasoning. Um, Motivated reasoning is most effective when there's some ambiguity. A lot of times the reason and evidence doesn't like absolutely demand that you take one position. A lot of times in reality, evidence for any kind of proposition is kind of a mixed bag. Like, is the new hire going to succeed? Well, we've got some evidence that they're going to have a successful career, and then there are also some things that cause concern. So it's not like the evidence is for all sorts of questions is just overwhelmingly, like decisively on one side. And so if there's some kind of ambiguity, some kind of mixed bag of evidence, that opens the door for people, making a case for their favored position. So motivated reasoning tends to thrive when there's some kind of ambiguity, which is often the case. Like few matters are like 100% certain where the evidence is, all on that side. And like the Trump supporter could say about the photograph, well, this photograph's misleading. They took this picture at a time like early in the ceremony. A lot of people came in later. You can always make these kinds of moves to, like, while that bit of evidence on its own might not support the hypothesis or the claim that Trump had a bigger crowd, you could say, oh, there's other evidence that does support it, and explain why that is, like, misleading.
Yeah, but I mean, another point that I was trying to make earlier, and I'm not sure if I was really clear on that, but I mean, sometimes if people hear Trump supporters saying that at the inauguration ceremony there were literally more people than you could find at the Obama inauguration ceremony, they tend to associate some sort of, I don't know, perhaps sometimes stupidity with it. Like, for example, oh my God, these people really do look at the two pictures side to side and they are saying that the Trump inauguration ceremony had more people there. That's just stupid. But I mean, it's not necessarily the case that people actually look at the picture and see more people there. They might not really see it, but they just sort of manifest this belief because they are Trump supporters and they wanted to have some sort of positive social. They wanted to function as a sort of social signal to other Trump supporters in that specific case, right?
Right, 100%. I mean, 100% agree. But you're imagining that person that they don't really believe this in that case, right?
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to ask you more about what you think are some of the main signaling functions of beliefs. But before we get specifically into the signaling function, so what would you say are some of the main general functions of beliefs?
Okay, so first, my kind of orthodox view, which is that primarily beliefs function to help us navigate the world. Okay, so a lot of philosophers cite the line from Ramsey that beliefs are the maps by which we steer. That's a very common view, and for the most part, I accept that. So I call that a navigational function. Beliefs help us navigate, like maps, our environment, and by that I mean they provide us with the means to achieve our desired ends. I want to have some potato chips. Well, I believe that they're in the pantry, so I steer myself to the pantry because that's the belief I have. I believe that the potato chips are there. So for the most part, I accept that orthodox view that beliefs have this navigational function. Okay, but I also think that there are all these interesting cases where beliefs have other functions because beliefs have other effects. They affect our confidence, they affect our emotions, they affect our, like, hedonically, our state of pleasure. Some beliefs make us happy. Some beliefs make us confident. They affect our social relations. People like us more when we have certain beliefs. Okay, so all these different effects can incentivize beliefs that might deviate from what's rational or what the evidence supports. So I think that beliefs can acquire new functions because of these non-epistemic benefits that they often provide us, like making us happy, giving us confidence, social acceptance, things like that. So when you have benefits or incentives, if it's possible for beliefs to vary so as to garner more benefits in those categories, we would expect that to happen, and we would expect new functions to be acquired for belief. Now, I think that these other functions are secondary to the primary function of navigation. I don't think most beliefs are for signaling purposes or are to make us feel happy or to give us confidence. But I think there are a lot of interesting cases of beliefs that actually do have these non-epistemic functions.
Mm-hmm. So, would you say that there are two main domains of functions that beliefs serve? I mean, the epistemic and the non-epistemic ones. Would that be fair to say?
Exactly. And then within the non-epistemic camp, I'd also make all sorts of other distinctions that I'm happy to make in greater detail. But yes, the big cut, the big divide is between beliefs had for epistemic reasons, which is, those are the bulk of our beliefs, I think. That's kind of I call that the primary function of belief. And it's the default function. Though there are some beliefs, some particular beliefs, whose primary function is not to navigate, but just to, like, signal or something like that. But those are, I think, the exceptions. So I'm interested in what I think are the interesting cases, the unusual cases because unusual, like, why would someone believe that? That's not what the evidence indicates. Okay, yeah.
I mean, between these two different categories, do you think that there's how would you divide, let's say, the beliefs between these two different categories? Do you think that depending on the belief, perhaps some of them might have strictly epistemic functions and others might only serve non-epistemic functions, and perhaps a few of them can serve both functions? How does it work exactly?
Okay, yeah, I do need to say a lot more here to clarify this. So when I talk about beliefs that have non-epistemic functions, I want to make clear that I'm still talking that these are really beliefs. So these are things that the person really does believe is true, and they should guide their actions. Like, they're supposed to still be genuine, real beliefs. And, a complication is that, like, there's kind of probably, like, at least psychologically speaking, if not conceptually speaking, you can't escape the demands of epistemology completely. That even if someone has a belief for non-epistemic reasons, they still recruit reasons and evidence to support those beliefs. And that might be necessary. That kind of activity might be necessary to have the belief. Like, so even if you have a belief for non-epistemic reasons, you have to play the epistemology game to some extent. That might be a conceptual point, or it might just be a point about psychological reality. Like, as a matter of psychological fact, we can't be completely indifferent to reasons and evidence. Okay. But like what really distinguishes the categories between epistemic and non-epistemic reasons for belief is what is the goal? Is the person motivated or aiming at getting the truth right, or do they have some other kind of goal, like they just want to have this belief, whether or not it's true, because it gives them benefits? Yeah.
So let's get then into the signaling functions. Would you say that signaling functions are always non-epistemic or fall under the purview of non-epistemic functions of beliefs, or how does it work?
Okay, good. So I've been writing a series of papers on this thesis I have, that beliefs sometimes function as signals, that they have signaling functions.
Okay.
And so let me say just a little bit about that first. So and I'm writing a book on this right now also, called The Signaling Mind. So when I say that beliefs are signals, I mean that in the sense that, there's a literature on animal signals, or in economics, what's called job market signaling. So in biology, the classic example is a peacock's tail feather is a signal of genetic fitness. Okay, so that tail feather was designed or selected to communicate to peahens that the peacock is genetically fit. Okay, or Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate in economics, has this view that education, like elite education, functions as a signal of quality in the job market. So if someone has Princeton graduate on their resume, that's supposed to be a reliable signal of quality as an employee, whether or not they learned anything at Princeton. It's just only someone who is of high quality supposedly can get admitted to Princeton and then graduate from Princeton. Okay, so when I say that beliefs are signals, I really mean that they function as signals in the same way that education does, or tail feather does for peacocks. The core of signaling is communication. Okay, if something has a signaling function, then it functions to communicate information. Okay, and that communicative function is acquired through natural selection sometimes, like in the case of peacock, but also can be acquired through cultural evolution or just individual learning. Like, we didn't evolve through natural selection to know that a Princeton degree means quality. That's something that's, culturally evolved. Okay, so if a belief is a signal, then that means that the person has the belief because other people detect that belief and treat them differently. Okay, so I think there's a pretty straightforward case that to me makes it like just overwhelmingly likely that beliefs function as signals. That is, other people detect our beliefs. In fact, we're pretty much universally wired to do so. We have this what's called mind reading capacity, where our minds are designed to detect what other people are thinking, in particular what it is that they believe. And then other people care about what we believe, and they treat us differently based on what they find there. So if other people can detect our beliefs, and other people care about what they find there and treat us differently based on what we believe, and there can actually be variation, like we can respond to these incentives, okay? And so like we can actually have beliefs that maybe diverge a little bit from the norms of epistemology, but give us these social benefits. Then inevitably we would expect some beliefs to be designed or selected for that reason, that they will function as signals. So the best candidates for beliefs that function as signals are going to be things that deviate somewhat from the norms of rationality or evidence-based judgment, so that they call out for a special explanation. Like, that's unusual. Just like a peacock's tail feather diverges from the norms of like flight. Like, feathers are normally like for flight, but this actually impedes flight. So we're like, why would the tail feather be like that? Oh, it has a communicative function, right? So similarly for beliefs, if they diverge from the norms of truth and reason, we say, why do they have? Oh, it's because of what they communicate. and how they manipulate other people. I don't know if I should pause there, but yeah.
But so this is very interesting because I mean, with this framework, we can also perhaps understand or understand a bit better where irrational beliefs or so-called irrational beliefs come from, right? Because I mean, there's even though they might be irrational from an epistemic perspective or epistemological perspective, they might still be functional. Right.
Right. So this is an important clarification we must make. So a lot of times when I just say irrational, I mean epistemically irrational, but they could be quite practically rational. Like
Right.
practically speaking, it can be rational for you to have these beliefs because of the benefits they give you, even though the beliefs themselves aren't well based in, the reason and evidence. They're not epistemically rational. So that's always like a qualification that needs to be made. So, like in the past, like people have known about motivated reasoning for a long time.
Yeah.
A lot of the literature in philosophy and psychology from like a few decades ago tended to focus on the personal effects, the personal benefits of motivated reasoning. So, like there's this literature on positive illusions that people are motivated to think better of themselves than they in fact are, self-enhancing beliefs, or the so-called better than average effect. And it's like, why would people want this? Or why would people be motivated to do this? Because it makes them feel good. So a lot of the explanations were like first person in terms of self-esteem, confidence, hedonic benefits. And also in the philosophy literature, people tend to think of self-deception as being, say, for the sake of just peace of mind. You just want to feel good. But there's been a more recent trend that I've been a part of, that Dan Williams has been a part of. That some of it is derived from someone else I know you've interviewed before, is Robert Trivers. His work on self-deception, that there is this social component to belief. That our beliefs, and this is what the signaling theory is getting at. That's one type of social effect that a lot of times we're motivated to acquire beliefs, not because necessarily they make us feel good. Like Trivers would say, natural selection doesn't really care about that, but it does care about whether or not you have alliances and you have people that are willing to cooperate and trust you. So maybe we self-deceive so as to manipulate other people. And a lot of times I use the word manipulate in a neutral sense, where it's not necessarily a bad thing. You just have certain effects on other people. So this is a trend that I find my work as being a part of, emphasizing that a lot of motivated reasoning is for social goals, okay, rather than just like personal goals like self-esteem or feeling good.
We will get into self-deception a bit later, but before that, let me just ask you another question. So, the way you approach beliefs from a signaling theory perspective, it also applies to at least some cognitive biases, correct?
Right. That's another good complication to point out. So I'll talk about certain particular beliefs being functional, but there are also belief-forming tendencies, including biases, that can be functional. So maybe it's advantageous for me to believe that I'm better at my job, as a better philosopher than I in fact am. It gives me confidence, and actually I'm more likely to get a raise if I project this belief to my colleagues, to the dean upstairs, and so on. Sorry, wait, I lost my.
I was asking you about the application of signaling theory to cognitive biases, or some cognitive biases.
So I'm sorry. I was saying that's a particular belief. Thank you. That benefits me, but also just like the general tendency to form self-enhancing beliefs as a bias, like you were talking about. can have this social explanation. So yeah, there's this granularity issue, like, are we looking at individual beliefs as being adaptive, or are we looking at belief forming tendencies as being adaptive? And I want to cover both. Like, in reality, it's probably belief forming tendencies that are more primarily adaptive. Like, Mother Nature, for example, would care about us having high social status, but in cultures that takes different forms. Like, is it academic achievement? Is it athletic achievement? There are particular forms that general bias can take in a particular cultural environment or setting. Yeah.
So I guess that this really puts an emphasis on the importance of our social environment and the fact that we are a social animal when it comes to understanding certain aspects of our cognition that would probably not be there if we didn't need to interact or establish relationships with other people, particularly in the long term, right? Because I mean, there's also, for example, a particular interpretation to the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, and I talked with some game theorists about this, where cognitive dissonance occurs not exactly because we we feel the need to explain to ourselves why we might have two conflicting beliefs, but we experience cognitive dissonance because we might need to explain to other people why we have a set of conflicting beliefs, right?
Right, and I'm sure, I know you're well aware of like programs like like the Paris School, Sperber, and stuff, where they think that a lot of reasoning is kind of directed at others,
Yeah.
right? And that, I think that's what you're getting at, is an example of this, where if you feel like we're going to be held, like other people are going to like take us to task, and yeah, so a lot of reasoning is directed at others, including resolving tension in the case of like cognitive dissonance, like you're describing. Exactly. Yes.
So we've talked about cognitive biases and also what we can call irrational beliefs, but in your work you also write about dangerous beliefs. So what is this category of beliefs?
Okay, good. So let me say why I've talked about dangerous beliefs at all. So whenever there's a communicative system like signals, there's a concern that some people will cheat, that there will be liars, right? And so one of the most fundamental claims in signaling theory is that there's this mechanism to ensure honest signaling, honest communication. That's costly signaling theory, or Zahavi's handicap principle, that if a signal is somehow costly to produce, the idea is that only someone who is an honest signaler can actually produce it. The important point is that the costs are too much for dishonest signalers. So the idea is that a peacock's tail feather is an honest signal of genetic fitness, because only a peacock that's actually genetically fit could afford to produce such a tail feather. Afford in the sense that it takes a lot of energy to produce it, but it also puts the peacock at great risk because it impedes flight and makes it more vulnerable to predation. So you have to be really fit to be able to have that handicap, that cost, and still survive. So you have to be genetically fit. Okay, so dangerous beliefs is supposed to be an example of applying costly signaling theory to beliefs as signals. So a dangerous belief is a belief that exposes you to real risk or harm, just like a peacock's tail feather exposes it to greater risk of predation. And so if a belief is dangerous, exposes you to real risks, then that shows that you have skin in the game. And like, if the belief is a signal, okay, then only someone who really has that signal quality could afford to take on that dangerous belief. So let's talk about examples in human culture that don't involve belief, before we get to dangerous beliefs, like things like tattoos, like gang tattoos. That's that's dangerous or costly in the sense that if you're not a gang member, you're not going to get that tattoo. Like especially it's like on your face or on your neck or something like that, where it's really visible because it burns bridges. It like cuts off opportunities for you. Only someone who's really in the gang is going to do that. Okay, so that shows that you're committed to the group. That's a costly signal. That's not belief, but it's a costly signal in the human realm. So let's give an example of costly belief signal that I think is kind of like a tattoo on the neck or on the face. So a couple years ago in the United States, I mean, this is still probably the case, but there's this huge partisan divide on the threat that COVID posed and the efficacy of vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
So there's people who are motivated to be vaccine skeptics because that aligned with their partisan affiliation. Like I belong to a certain party, and how do we signal that we're committed to this party or to this person who leads the party? Well, we say that COVID is a hoax and that the vaccines are not effective. In fact, they're dangerous. Okay. Now, if someone actually believes that, I think someone can actually believe that for signaling purposes. They could be motivated to believe that because it signals their partisan commitments. Okay. And that I think is a good example of a dangerous belief because it's too risky to fake that. If you really thought that the vaccines were effective, you couldn't forego getting the vaccine. It's only someone who's a true believer, truly committed, who would be willing to take on that belief. It shows that you really have skin in the game. Okay, just like getting a tattoo on your face or your neck shows that you're really committed to the gang. It's a costly signal. So by dangerous beliefs, I mean costly signals, and I mean these to be real beliefs. Like the person really believes it. So we think, oh, yeah, like when I think COVID denial and vaccine skepticism, that's a particularly good example of dangerous belief because these people really believe this stuff. They're not getting vaccinated. So they're genuinely showing their commitment to that tribe or that group. So someone else who writes on these types of issues, like Dan Williams, he tends to think that the signals of group identity, like the beliefs maybe that indicate what party you belong to, are often like ideological and kind of disconnected from action, like things you can just say that don't really affect how you live your life. But I think a lot of times the best signals are ones that actually do drive actions, because they're good. That means that they're good indicators. They pass the honesty standard, like they're costly signals. They show like where you really stand. Now, the problem with costly signals or dangerous beliefs is that they're also costly. Like the costliness makes them believable. Like, oh, okay, people really believe, but they expose you to great risk. So it comes with a negative as well.
But do you think that the fact that they are costly, or at least generally more costly than beliefs that are not dangerous, makes them more effective in their signaling function?
I think so. I mean, for a couple of reasons. Like what I've just been emphasizing is the cost of it. That okay, only someone who's a true believer would be willing to take on those costs. But also, dangerous beliefs just tend to clearly demarcate groups. They make for a sharp division. So it makes it very, like signals are supposed to communicate, and it very clearly communicates, okay, you're not on this side, you're on this side, you're doing something radical, extreme, dangerous. So signaling, beliefs that function as signals tend to lead to polarization, because the whole point is to distinguish groups, to communicate what side you're on. So like I'm giving a lot of examples involving partisanship, but like political beliefs that function as signals often serve the function of being like litmus tests. Like, okay, here's a litmus test for being a Republican in the United States. do you believe that climate change is not human caused, or there isn't even climate change? Do you believe that abortion is murder? Like all these kinds of things are signals, and if they're signals, there's a normative force. Like this is what you should believe, right? And they clearly demarcate the groups, and so that's what the signaling function is supposed to explain. A lot of polarization, I think, because signals, think of animal signals, we want them to be vivid. Like a frog that has a signal that it's toxic, it's going to be brightly colored. Normally in nature, you don't want to be brightly colored. You want to be camouflaged, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're trying to communicate something, you want it to be very vivid and sharp. You want the peacock's tail feathers to be colorful and so on. And how do we make a belief vivid or sharp? We make it extreme. Okay, we have strong norms behind it. We give it a standard of like, okay, this is a litmus test. Okay, are you a Republican in good standing, or are you a Christian in good standing? Do you know the creed? And are you willing to endorse like very strong claims, like there's one path to salvation, and in fact, God is three people. Okay, so these creedal doctrines become litmus tests for group membership, and they clearly demarcate the groups. Like people who aren't Christians aren't going to like accept Trinity or things like this. Yeah.
Since you're mentioning some religious examples there, do you think that this concept of dangerous beliefs would connect in any way to what in the cognitive science of religion people call credibility enhancing displays? That is, yes. Costly behaviors or participating in costly rituals to really signal strongly that you are committed to a particular religion, for example.
Exactly, yes. So there's this literature, like figures from a couple decades ago who started writing that, like Sosis and Irons. Others have written about rituals and practices being costly signals. And basically, it's an extension of that same logic, that just like the behaviors serve a signaling function, the underlying psychological states can also serve a signaling function. And as a matter of fact, when you just behave in a certain way, you tend to internalize the beliefs that would rationalize those behaviors.
Mm-hmm. By the way, this idea just came to my mind because whenever we talk about the signaling functions of beliefs, we usually tend to think about people positively signaling something to the group they want to be part of or that they are part of already. But do you think that perhaps there are also costly beliefs that function the other way around? I mean, if I, for example, am part of a group, but I want to leave it, then I start espousing beliefs that really run counter to the beliefs that are normative in that particular group to signal to those people that I want to distance myself from them. Do you think that would also work that way?
Yeah, good point. So, signals always have an audience, and the same signal can be addressed to different kinds of audiences. It could be addressed to your in-group to show that you're with them, but it could, like you're talking about, could be just as well addressed to an out-group to say, I'm not one of you, to establish kind of contrast. I mean, you see this a lot of times on social media and stuff where people are just trying to like trigger the liberals or something like that. They'll say something to signal like, I'm not with you. Like they'll go out of their way to be antagonistic and to say that they are another. So very good point. Signals can be directed at the out group just as much as they can be directed at an in group. And another point I should back up and say is that when I say that there are beliefs that are adaptive in these ways, that have signaling functions, I don't think that we're typically consciously aware of what we're doing and scheming to have beliefs, with these particular functions. I think normally these are acquired unconsciously without our awareness. Just like you might have a belief that's motivated because it makes you feel good, but you're not aware of the fact that that's why you have the belief. Likewise, we have beliefs that function to communicate things to other people, but I'm not saying this is part of a conscious, intentional plan that we have. It's purposive, okay, and it's functional, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's intentional or conscious.
Yeah, that bit about them not necessarily being intentional or conscious, I think makes a good segue to self-deception. But just before we get into it specifically, let me just ask you one more question about dangerous beliefs. So, because they are generally, I guess, so costly, do you think that we should expect them to be more common among more extreme social groups? So let's say, for example, if we're talking about politics, that these dangerous beliefs would be more common among people who are part of the extreme right or the extreme left, or not necessarily?
Right, right. So costly signals in general, like why are there costs? Well, there are costs because there's a concern about cheaters, okay,
Uh-huh.
dishonest signalers, and this could be an objection to my view. It's like, what's the incentive? Is there evidence that people are incentivized to fake their partisan affiliations? And if not, then we don't need costly signaling at all, because costly signaling is just to deter cheaters. And if there's no incentive to cheat, then you don't need costly signaling at all.
Right.
Well, well, I think dangerous beliefs not only show your group identity, but also your level of commitment to that group. Okay, so it's not just that it shows that you belong on a certain team, that there's a certain tribe you're a member of, but it's supposed to show your degree of commitment to that tribe. And that's probably a signal that's directed to in-group members. So dangerous beliefs can be incentivized to show your degree of commitment. Like, yeah, so polarization, you can see this logic. Like, people think, okay, the more extreme my position, the more I show I'm devoted to the team, tribe, more committed. And that would be an in-group directed communication. So that can explain dangerous beliefs, not because people are incentivized to fake being right-wing, but just amongst those who are right-wing, there's some who are more committed than others. And how do we discern who are the most committed? Well, that's where dangerous or maybe just extreme beliefs play a role in knowing who are the most loyal, committed group members.
Yeah, but I mean, the question I asked you, perhaps what I had in mind was something more along these lines. So, for you to express dangerous beliefs, of course, people that are part of the group you want to signal to have to accept and tolerate those beliefs, right? So, so for example, I would imagine that. People that are, for example, on the far right or the far left would be tolerant of a higher number of dangerous beliefs than someone who is a moderate or a centrist or someone like that. I mean, I'm not sure if this makes sense or not.
No, I, yeah, I take your point that they have to be tolerant of them, but I don't know that they actually have to accept them. So, like, for example, you might have elites in a political party that, let's say, they don't care about gun rights at all, really.
Yeah.
They care about just like tax policy or something like that, but they will tolerate amongst their the masses like extreme positions on gun rights, because it shows commitment to that group, even if the elites don't share that. They themselves maybe don't accept that, but they'll tolerate that because okay, we know that they're committed to me. They take this extreme position on gun rights, but maybe the elite partisans perhaps don't even care about that. They just care about like tax policy or something like that. So they could value a belief, in-group members could value a belief as a signal of group commitment, even if those group members don't share that belief. They themselves don't accept it. But they're like, okay, this is good. This is a good test, nonetheless, to show to be assured that they're committed to us.
Right. So let's get now into self-deception then. So, what is self-deception? I mean, what kind of framework do you use to tackle self-deception? Because there's the sort of Robert Trivers's self-deception kind of approach, and then there are also other approaches to self-deception. So, do you adopt a particular approach? And do you think that self-deception would connect in any way to what we've been talking about, beliefs in general?
Good. I mean, there's a ton to say here. I've written a book on self-deception, and I came from this originally from like the just philosophical literature, where, reading people like Donald Davidson or Al Mealy and Robert Audi, figures like that on self-deception. It's only more recently, well, last 10 years maybe, that I've shifted to this other kind of literature, like you're talking about, like Robert Trivers, but also there's the economics literature on basically what's self-deception. Okay, so first, what is self-deception? There's a lot of disagreement as to how we should categorize self-deception, but at a minimum, self-deception, I take it, is motivated irrationality that serves some kind of purpose. So the idea is like you want to believe, you're incentivized to believe something, okay, either because it makes you feel good or gains you social benefits or whatever. There's some kind of motivation or incentive to believe something. The evidence does not actually support that belief that you're motivated to have. And so you have to engage in some kind of deceptive enterprise to get yourself to believe what you want to believe. That's basically the core of self-deception as I understand it. So it's purposive, motivated irrationality. Now, beyond that, one of the big divisions in the philosophical literature on self-deception is between what are called intentionalists and motivationalists. So I just said that the self-deceived have some kind of project where they're trying to get themselves towards a favored belief that the evidence doesn't support. Well, are they intending to deceive themselves? Is this an intentional project, or are they merely motivated? That's the division between intentionalism and motivation. Motivationalist accounts. Are they intending to deceive themselves, or are they just, as a matter of fact, motivated? Okay, so how involved is the agent in their own deception? Because there are all sorts of paradoxes that arise. Like, Ricardo, if I want to deceive you, it's easy to understand how that can happen because I can have information that you don't have. And so, like, I can hide things from you and I can set up fake evidence in order to mislead you. But when you apply that to the self, where the deceiver and the deceived are one and the same person, that doesn't seem really coherent. How can I hide something from myself? If I know enough to hide it, then it's not really hidden from me. Like, it seems like it would be impossible to succeed if it's this intentional project that's carried out. Okay. Now, and so there are these philosophers who have what's called a deflationary approach to self-deception. They think, it's just basically a motivated bias. Like Al Mealy's book from about 20 years ago is a classic example of this kind of account, where you just have these biases, hot biases that are motivated, and that's what it is to be self-deceived. It's not really an intentional project like Donald Davidson, or before that, Freud thought it was, self-deception is a very kind of like, you have little agents basically in your mind. You've got the id, and you've got the superego, you got a sensor here, all this stuff. I think that there's actually self-deception that is quite sophisticated, where the unconscious mind shows really strong evidence of scheming against the conscious mind. I think there are very robust, sophisticated unconscious powers. There can be unconscious goal pursuit. So I think it's possible for there to be self-deception in which the person is really actively involved in a self-deceptive project that shows that deep down they know exactly what evidence to avoid, They know what kind of rationalizations are convincing and which aren't. Maybe deep down they do have some possession of the truth. And it's like interpersonal deception, but in the first person case, the unconscious mind is holding on to these truths that it's not letting the conscious mind access. Now, I also think that there are these other cases, like the Al-Mealy type cases, where people are just motivated to believe something, like that they're better than average, and there's nothing more sophisticated than that going on. And I'm willing to count those as cases of self-deception as well. So I'm very liberal as to what I count as self-deception, but I tend to be more interested in what I call the cases of robust self-deception, where the self-deception seems to go beyond merely being a motivated bias. There really does seem to be some kind of agency involved, and a lot of times the unconscious seems to be playing a prominent role, and there's evidence maybe of dual belief, that the person kind of believes the truth, even though the conscious mind is thinking and asserting what's false. Yeah, I'll pause there.
No, right. I mean, I was thinking about how to unpack that, but I mean, first of all, do you tend to fall more on the camp of the intentionalists or the motivationalists?
Okay, it depends on what you mean by that. Do I think self-deception must be this kind of intentional project, or at least a project that like really robustly involves the person's agency? I don't think that's necessary for self-deception, but there are deflationists who think not only is that not necessary, but it's not possible that the person could be actively involved in this self-deceptive project. I certainly think it's possible. I think it's actual. I think there are actual cases where a person is actively involved in their own deception, very similarly to how I could be actively involved in deceiving you as a different person. Okay, so do I think self-deception requires intentions to deceive or active agency? No. Do I think that that occurs? Yes. Do I think that there's self-deception that where the person is really actively involved as an agent in a deceptive project? Yes. I think it occurs, even though it's not necessary for self-deception.
But the person being actively involved in a self-deception process, could you give us an example of how that would happen?
Very good. Okay. So let's take a classic example of self-deception, like a husband. There's evidence at hand that his wife is being unfaithful. Okay. He's motivated to not believe this, though. He has an incentive. This is understandable. He doesn't want to believe that his wife is being unfaithful. Maybe the evidence suggests that she's having an affair with a particular person. Okay. So she's away from the house, and the husband's going to go out, and the quickest route would involve driving by the house of the man that there's reason to think that she's actually having an affair with.
Right.
If he goes out of his way to avoid driving that route, like avoidance behavior, to me that's evidence that the person knows exactly where not to look, and that they at least suspect that she's there, and they don't want to confront that reality. So when people engage in avoidance behavior, I think that shows that they suspect, if not outright believe, the truth, but they're taking active steps to make sure they avoid confronting that reality. This happens all the time, not just with like someone having an affair potentially, but like as a parent, maybe there's evidence that reason to believe that my child is doing drugs that I don't want them to do, and so I make a point of like not searching their pockets. When I'm doing the laundry, I don't want to confront. So if someone strategically knows exactly what to avoid, okay, and if that is sophisticated enough, to me that's some evidence that okay, they're actively engaging in a deceptive process. They're manipulating their evidence as an agent. Okay.
Mhm.
The self-deception isn't something that's just passively affecting them, like a motive affecting reasoning. No, they're taking steps, they're making efforts to participate in their own deception, and perhaps in a way that indicates that they know or at least suspect more than what they're letting on.
Right. I mean, I understand the example, but I mean, this is sort of a complicated thought, but I will try my best to articulate it. But I mean, perhaps this is a matter of how I understand self-deception and perhaps how you understand self-deception. But I mean, in that particular case, I understand, yeah, avoiding a particular source of information prevents you from getting access to that information, and you're doing that to yourself. Yeah, I understand that. But when I usually think about self-deception, I tend to think about something like, okay, so even if you have access to a particular kind of information, you're, I don't know, it's complicated, but perhaps consciously you do not really get, I mean, consciously that information does not play a role in how you behave. So, for example, let's say that I that I self-deceive that I self-deceive into believing that I am more intelligent than I really am. So, if that's the case, then what I would be doing is that I wouldn't even know or wouldn't even perhaps have any sort of idea that I was really less intelligent than I think I am. So that would mean in the particular case of, for example, my wife, or I suspecting that my wife might be cheating on me. I mean, not even having access, conscious access to that feeling, or that she might be cheating on me to begin with, sort of suppressing that thought or idea or belief or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm being clear here, because at least in my mind, these are very complicated stuff. But what do you think about it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of suppression and repression in self-deception.
Mm.
You're, I mean, you're suppressing your motives a lot of times,
Yeah.
and you're also suppressing like how you're responding to those motives. The fact that they're affecting your evidence search and your rationalizations or your hypothesis generation, right? You have to suppress a lot of that stuff. So this gets at what's called the dynamic puzzle of self-deception. Like, how could we possibly succeed at deceiving ourselves if all this were before us?
No.
If I'm deceiving you, if you knew everything that I was doing, you wouldn't be deceived. Right? If you could read my mind and see my actions,
Yeah.
you wouldn't be deceived. So in the first person case, if I was aware of my motives and what I was doing, there's no possible way I could succeed at self-deception. There has to be some kind of opacity to it. Okay. And another complication is we can't just believe what we want to believe. Right? We cannot believe at will. And that means that there has to be some kind of these intermediary steps. There has to be some kind of machinations, like a process we go through, and we cannot be fully aware of that. So I think that self-deception inevitably involves a failure of self-knowledge. Okay, we can't be aware of what we're up to or even our motives. And like Freud was very much onto this this fact, right? This is, I mean, I'm not a Freudian across the board, but I think there are a lot of insights from Freud that are true, that the unconscious mind is very robust and powerful, and that there are these motives and operations that we're not consciously aware of. And there are processes we can go through that make ourselves aware of these things. This goes back to kind of your opening questions today. You know, and that should give us knowledge that would make the self-deceptive project evaporate. Like, so self-deception cannot operate in a transparent mind. There has to be some degree of opacity in order for self-deception to be effective. Now, another thing you didn't mention earlier was the connection between self-deception and signaling. So I definitely think that there are connections between these things. So I write on self-deception, I write on signaling. I see these both as species of motivated or incentivized irrationality. Okay, that can sometimes be adaptive. I'm not saying that they're always adaptive. Like, I'm not saying that self-deception is always adaptive, at least, but it sometimes might be, I think. And not all self-deception is for the sake of signaling. Trivers, his account of self-deception does emphasize something like signaling, that we self-deceive in order to communicate this to other people. He thinks fundamentally we self-deceive so as to better deceive others.
Right.
Okay, so it has a communicative function. That's where I actually kind of got my belief signaling. This was a big influence on me in coming up with the signaling hypothesis, Trivers' account of self-deception, where self-deception really isn't first personal. That's not the function or benefit primarily. It's communicative. Okay, but Trivers emphasized transmitting a belief to other people. Like, you have a belief so as to better deceive others, to transmit that falsehood to others. We self-enhance so that other people come to acquire our self-enhancing beliefs. They think better of us also, okay? Now, in my first paper on beliefs as signals, I say, well, the social purpose isn't always like Trivers says. Sometimes we don't want to transmit a belief, or we're not so interested in that. We just want to advertise the fact that we have a certain belief so that people classify us and think of us in a certain way. Like, oh, he's a Christian. He's not going to lie. He's going to take oaths seriously, or, you know, whatever. Even if they're not Christian, like the value isn't necessarily in transmitting the belief to someone else, but just in them attributing the belief to us, and then inferring that we have certain qualities on the basis of that belief attribution, just like the peahen, in effect, of course not consciously, infers that the peacock is genetically fit because it has an impressive tail feather. And so I think, so Trivers had this account of self-deception that's to communicate something to others. I said, well, we might just signal a belief to others, and So I think beliefs as signals are incentivized, are motivated, and that self-deception certainly plays a role in maintaining beliefs as signals. Okay, that we're motivated to have these beliefs, and a lot of times the evidence doesn't support it, and we engage in a process of self-deception to maintain the beliefs that function as signals.
In your mind, what would you say are the main functions of self-deception?
Okay, so I would make another big division. Like, there are these kind of personal functions of self-deception, where sometimes we do self-deceive just to feel good, or to boost our self-esteem, or to get confidence. Where, I mean, that's a personal, where regardless of whether or not there are social benefits to it. Okay. And then there's this other category of functions that self-deception serves, which are social. Okay, that we self-deceive to conform to our society, to have what Dan Kahan, we probably know his work, calls identity protective cognition. Okay, that's basically kind of like conformity. We want to belong to the group, be part of the group, or what I would call signaling. Sometimes we self-deceive in order to have a belief that gives us social value, some kind of social benefit as a signal. Okay, so there are all sorts of functions that self-deception serves. The two categories I would emphasize are the personal and the social. So the personal in the psychological literature, stuff on positive illusions captures that kind of functionality. For the social, the Trivers, the Kahan, the stuff on signaling gets at those kinds of functions, those literatures.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one last question then. With all of those functions in mind, do we know if self-deception works? I mean, so I will just mention an example, but you can go through the other functions as well. So when it comes to using self-deception to then deceive other people, I mean, to make other people believe that we are a certain way that we ourselves also believe, even though it doesn't really correspond to the truth. Does it work or not?
I mean, as a general rule, I think so. If you're asking specifically if self-deception works so as to better convince others, just think of, I mean, anecdotal examples, from real life. If someone's a salesperson, they're probably going to be more effective if they actually believe in the product themselves. Okay, you're more convincing if you actually have the belief yourself. So I think the answer to the question is yes, self-deception works, generally speaking, as a strategy in better convincing others, because you're more convincing if you genuinely have the belief yourself. I think that's true. So if I could try to convince my boss that I deserve a raise by either just outright kind of lying or thinking I deserve, saying I deserve the raise when I don't really believe it. But I think I'm going to be more convincing if I actually believe it myself. So yeah, like Trivers focuses on things like cognitive load. If you don't actually have the belief yourself, then you have to have these two representations in mind, the fictional one, the lie, and then the truth, and that this is taxing, and that if we're under cognitive load, we'll kind of tip our hand and reveal what we actually believe. We'll have these moments of kind of weakness where people will see through and know that we're lying, and so it won't be as effective. Okay, and also Trivers emphasizes that we tend to punish liars, and so that's a real risk you expose yourself to if you're not actually self-deceived. But if you're self-deceived, even if people find out that we were wrong, that we're not as good as we said we were, if they know that we really believed it, they're not going to punish us as much. We don't punish people for being wrong, for having false beliefs, generally speaking. We punish people for being liars. Okay, that's the bad thing. So yeah, I mean, I do think self-deception is effective if the goal is to communicate something to other people, because we're more convincing. Now, if the question is more generally, does self-deception work? I mean, we got to flag the worries here, also the concerns. Just like there are problems with lies, like lies tend to spread. People are very familiar with this. A lie, it's difficult to keep it contained. And so too with self-deception. If we self-deceive about one thing, a lot of times it spreads, and when it forces us to be self-deceptive about other matters. So if we, go to one of our earlier examples, vaccine skepticism. Like maybe if the scientific consensus is that the vaccine is effective, now we have to be skeptical about science in general. So, it just spreads, and this can get us in trouble, because maybe we don't want to reject science wholesale, but we're pushed in that kind of direction. I mean, another worry about self-deception is that reality tends to matter and force itself upon us. So if we're engaged in self-deception, this isn't this is a big point about self-deception. It's an ongoing project, because it's not enough to just get yourself to believe something. You have to maintain that belief, right? And so there's always new evidence coming in. So the world's feeding you new evidence that you have to accommodate in your motivatedly biased way. Not just that, but other people are telling you things. And so self-deception isn't a one-time thing. You can't do it just once. It's this ongoing project. So it can be quite taxing. But all that being said, Yeah, I mean, self-deception certainly works. Like there are people that have self-deceptive beliefs that persist an entire lifetime. So it is possible to have these sustained, and that you systematically filter, bias, and interpret evidence in a way that towards your favorite belief.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Funkhouser, I hope that whenever you finish your upcoming book, The Signaling Mind, I will have you back on the show. Just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Okay, yeah. So I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas. I have a site there at University of Arkansas. If you Google me, I have a Google site. It's Google Sites, and that's at eFunko. But if you Google it, it'll come up right away. Eric Funkhouser. I'm on Twitter as well, and I have a Phil People. If there's a lot of philosophers out there, Phil People profile. That's another good way to access me and my papers and books. So,
Okay,
but my
great.
website is probably the best way. Yeah.
Okay, I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview, and thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
I really enjoyed it, Ricardo, and I like your series of interviews more generally. You're doing a great service to all of us. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Pererga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Saim Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, the RPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.